start, because we are short on time, introducing the people who are on the screen to you, and then moving straight into the questioning. So first of all, we have Tim Clement-Jones. Tim is a member of the UK House of Lords and former chair of the House of Lords Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and most of you will have read the report from that committee, and co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on artificial intelligence. Welcome, Tim. Then thank you. Then I move to Martin, who has just joined us. He is of Counsel at Covington and Burling LLP. Welcome, Martin. Moving then to Eva Kaili, who is an MEP and chair of the Future of Science and Technology panel at the European Parliament. Welcome, Eva.
Thank you.
And then VK Rajah, who is a former Attorney General and is the current chairman of the Advisory Council on Ethical Use of AI and Data in Singapore. Welcome.
Thank you.
And last but by no means least, we have Jim Shaughnessy, who is Executive Vice President and Head of Global Affairs at the company Workday. I think many of us are working with Workday in our daily lives. So welcome, Jim. Let me start with a question to all of you, but perhaps so that you're not all wondering who's going to go first answering the question, I will ask Martin to go first. COVID has changed our lives, our societies, and the way that many people think about technology, maybe for good or ill. And so I'm wondering what you have all seen in your individual roles in the way that people have maybe been more prepared or less prepared to give up their privacy, their digital privacy, in order to keep safe. And whether we're seeing advances in AI that perhaps you wouldn't have expected to move as quickly, but for the pandemic. So Martin, perhaps you could kick us off with an answer.
Sure, thank you very much. And thank you again for the opportunity to participate on the panel. This is terrific. It's a great question, and COVID really has accelerated the use of AI and across really a number of dimensions. And what I'd love to focus on is what's been remarkable is the sort of breadth of applications in which AI is being used. So for some examples, the US Department of Veterans Affairs recently announced that they're using AI to determine when they have patients come in who are COVID positive, to determine what is their likely prognosis so they can figure out who should be going into what form of care and who should go to other forms of care. Governments are also using AI-powered tools to offer online assessments to people so that if they suspect they might be COVID positive, they can go online and assess themselves through chatbots and other AI mechanisms. Companies are using AI tools to see virus transmission chains and see how virus is spreading across different populations. And even scientists are using AI to evaluate all the huge number of articles that are coming out around COVID, to evaluate the sort of reliability and the accuracy of those articles. So I think what's interesting about all those and many other examples of the use of AI to address COVID is that there's really the context matters. And in some of these situations, yes, privacy is going to be a top concern, but in others, accuracy is going to be a real major concern. In others, bias will be the major concern. And so it's hard to sort of have a blanket statement of this is the concern that needs to be raised. I think it really shows that context matters when evaluating this. And to pick up on what Francesca said in her presentation, it's not to look just at AI as a thing. Often we'll miss this. It's hard to regulate there at that aspect. It's really how is it being deployed and what are the risks that are arising in that deployment that are worth looking at. So when thinking about regulation, I think that thinking about it contextually is like we should look at where are the scenarios where the greatest concerns are going to arise and focus on that. And also not focusing less on looking at the AI system that is being dealt with, and more at, well, what are the harms that we're really trying to address? Is it privacy, or are there other harms that are more important in this scenario, like accuracy, like security?
Thank you. So perhaps bringing us back to this acceptance of technology because of the pandemic. Tim, I'd like to go to you because it may seem to many that the tracking and tracing applications using AI in the UK were not particularly well received by the UK public. And so perhaps you could take up this theme of whether we're actually getting more adjusted to AI or not because of this pandemic.
I think that's a very shrewd question, Kay. We've had our own moments this year in terms of, experience of new technology. I mean, I entirely take Martin's point, but the trouble is that if it's done badly, as for instance, we had two versions of our COVID app. The first was proposed to be a centralized app, which was designed to suck up data from individuals. Eventually, because it didn't fit with the Apple and Google protocols, it was abandoned, but only after an awful lot of people got very overheated. On the government side, it was going to be the thing that cracked track and trace. On the other side, it was the biggest disaster for individuals whose privacy was going to be infringed and so on. And then, of course, we had the debacle over exam assessment and algorithms. Now, actually, it wasn't really AI. It was an algorithm, but it wasn't really AI. But nevertheless, the use of the word algorithm and the fact that that system became public enemy number one was not at all helpful. And then, of course, you get into the realms of people getting concerned about their health data without government reassurance. And I entirely take Martin's point. I thought Francesca was 100% right on the whole idea of, if you like, a regulatory risk. You don't regulate if there's a low risk, but you do start thinking about regulation if there's a high risk. But, we have GDPR in place for data, but nevertheless, because of the signals that people give, it raises public fears. And so, the onus is on policymakers and regulators to provide that reassurance. And I don't think yet that people have woken up to the need to do that. I think certain bodies have. I think the EU is doing a very good job. I think the Council of Europe is putting together a very interesting feasibility study. But, I think there are many governments that don't quite understand the worry that people have about this.
Super. Thank you very much, Tim. So moving to Jim, obviously you deal with privacy and private data all the time, and you bring to this roundtable the business voice. Have you seen any changes in the way that your customers are reacting to your tools, or just in the wider world that you are involved in business because of the pandemic?
Well, yes, and thanks again for the opportunity to be here. For people who don't know Workday, we are an enterprise software company that offers human capital management and financial management solutions in the cloud. While we're a relatively young company, only 15 years old, we've been blessed with very rapid growth. And so we now offer our service. Our services have been subscribed to by 60% of the Fortune 50, more than 3,000 companies. We currently have 45 million workers globally whose data are managed with Workday. And so we and other enterprise cloud companies have been an important part of the digital transformation that companies have been able to accomplish over the last 15 or 20 years that have involved moving large parts of their computing infrastructure to the cloud. And that only has worked because we've been able to establish trust. People trust that our computing environment is secure, our networking environment is secure, that the employees' data and their other customer data will be will be protected, it'll be safe, and that we have an environment where privacy and other important interests are protected. And because we've accomplished that over the last 15 years, what we've found is that in this last year, when companies themselves have been stressed, their operations have been stressed, their infrastructures have been stressed, their people have been stressed, every part of life is stressful, that they are embracing the digital transformation, and that they are looking for machine learning enabled tools that will help them accelerate the transition and make better decisions. And so we've offered products that help companies look throughout their organization to find employees with the skills necessary to perform, particular tasks. Because we're a tech company, we call it a gig, but form a task that lets them have a broader view of their talent. And people are, because we've been able to establish trust, are embracing those solutions. And we think that that's a useful pathway. And it's why the title of today's session resonated so much with us, because regulation can be helpful in establishing trust for AI if it's focused on identifying and addressing the right risk and providing a governance structure that causes those risks to be addressed. And so we think that the uptake will continue with an environment where companies understand their principles, articulate those principles, and adopt very clearly methods to operationalize their adherence to those principles, and similarly are both accountable and transparent to all their important constituencies.
Super, thank you very much. And so, Eva, coming to you and the European view, what have you been finding in Europe about the willingness, perhaps, or lack of it, to trade off digital privacy for safety?
Well, thank you for the excellent organization and panel. I'm very proud to be among such speakers. And thank you also for the question. So the European Union and the European fundamental values that we based our rule of law on, I think it clarifies a bit what the vision will be also for the next day. So I heard Tim saying that the contact tracing apps, they started raising questions and showing the contradictions that we have to respond to. So to your question, Kay, we are not ready to compromise anything. So I'm sorry that we have, in some countries beyond the EU, citizens have to choose between privacy or safety. In Europe, we try to have both. It should be our guide to have privacy and safety at the same time, by using Bluetooth technologies, for example, without storing private data, and also with the approach that the European Commission actually set out, and we will support it in the Parliament, which is low risk and high risk applications and per sector. So basically, for low risk, we will have different criteria, more easy access to data. For the high risk, more tough security criteria. So we are now going to develop legislation for the governance of data sets. And you understand that having to track location is something that citizens will have to have a choice. And having a choice doesn't mean yes or no. It means yes while using the application, yes for a specific time, yes for a specific cause. So we have to give them more options, more alternatives. And this is up to us. And this is how we're going to create the trusted environment for AI in Europe. And this is what we're trying also to do on a global level, to agree at least on a common framework for responsible human-centric AI. Because in Europe, when you enter your internet, you feel that your government took down the spam, the fake sites, they have protected you if something goes wrong, and then you can go to the court and have a fair decision and find where your data were, who controlled them, what happened. So we have to continue doing that. So we have to update all our regulations and legislation into the digital era. But we know where we want to go, and we don't need to compromise privacy.
Super, thank you very much for that, Eva. And moving then to Singapore, VK, you're head of work on ethics of data and AI. Can you tell us how Singapore citizens have reacted to this trade-off between being safe and data privacy?
First, thank you for having me on the panel. I'm 13 hours ahead of New York time, so it's early in the morning.
Thank you for joining us.
Not at all. This is an important panel and an important audience. First, I want to say that I'm on the same page as your other panel members insofar as saying that there needs to be a balance between the use of data, privacy, and the public good. And it's interesting. I start off with observation, and this is not peculiar to Singapore, because I think on a personal level and also on a broader level, we cast a watchful eye on what's happening both in the neighborhood and globally. So you would notice that the countries which were exposed or had previous experiences with SARS and MERS in the last 10, 15 years have been better prepared to deal with the pandemic. And among them, and this is not a question of the different forms of governance, it's also a question of culture. So the countries that have been most successful in dealing with the pandemic up to now have a mixture of governance models. You have on one side, you have China, Vietnam. Then on the other side, you have Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Singapore, and a handful of other East Asian countries. And so what has actually distinguished them is the fact that first, they've had previous experience in dealing with these problems at a national level. And secondly, I think populations that are willing to make trade-offs in terms of how privacy can sometimes be overridden. And I'm very cautious here, in limited circumstances. There's no blank check in terms of allowing either governments or other agencies to invade every level of personal security or personal information. So, and I think there has been acceptance that in return for the proper use of data, for example, contacts with people over an extended period in case infection is picked up, that this is for a proper purpose. And therefore, there's acceptance that this can be done. And I think the best example of this is probably South Korea. No one is going to disagree that South Korea hasn't got all the trappings of a democratic society. But they have come from a lot of experience because of their exposure over the last decade and a half to a number of problems. So coming back to Singapore, I'm pleased to share with you that over the last 7 days, we have had no locally transmitted cases. The only cases, and they can be counted in the hands of one finger or one palm, fingers of one palm, have been imported cases where you have returnees coming back to Singapore and they're quarantined. So we had quite a few bumps along the way over the last few months, but I think we have come to a model which I think Thomas Puyo has described as the Swiss cheese model, where you build up fences and where you create bubbles and where there's a limited amount of data mining that is allowed for the common good.
Super, thank you. And you raised these important points of trust and the common good and politics as well. So perhaps I could go to my two politicians on the panel, Eva and Tim. I don't know who'd like to go first, but is what we're seeing in the backlash perhaps against using AI in COVID response. politically driven, the refusal to use masks? Is that what you're seeing in your areas or countries, regions? Tim, you're speaking, but you're on mute.
Shall I kick off? Sorry, Kay.
Please.
Well, you know, I'm broadly very positive about the adoption of AI, but you have to have the conditions that are right. And there is this crossover with the whole data agenda, which you've really highlighted. And, you know, when you have books like Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, we've had a recent book by Clarissa Beres, Privacy and Power, for instance, you know, they've highlighted the importance of autonomy, in a sense, in terms of personal data. And what I think governments need to do, if we're going to get acceptance, because after all, machine learning is the predominant AI technology, which needs a huge amount of data in order to be effective. What we need to have is governments that really understand what needs to be done in terms of personal privacy, in terms of governance, in terms of transparency, explainability, all those things, because otherwise they're not creating the conditions for innovation and so on. And, you know, that's what politicians need to do. It's to create the context. It's not to overly interfere in the, if you like, the innovation process. They create the conditions. And you've got, you know, we can talk about the impact of regulation later on, no doubt. But you know, that's the cardinal principle. And I don't think we're getting that right yet. We have to move faster, I think, is the answer.
Super. Thank you, Tim. To Eva.
Well, let me say that AI is not a vaccine. So the truth is that it can provide us with plenty of solutions, and it could actually even take decisions. But it's up to us to decide how we're going to use AI. And in order so during the pandemic, we could use it to share more data, to understand patterns, to be able to find the treatment, or even how to prevent this disease, or what works best by using all this data that we can collect. The problem was, as I mentioned before, we don't have common standards, so we collect data that we cannot use. They are not of good quality, or they are not matching. And especially in Europe, we have different languages, different legal systems, different health systems. It was really impossible. So we have to set up some common standards, and then we have to have a way to collect, share, and use this data in an appropriate way with legal certainty for all the companies, but also for startups and SMEs. So we have to give them access, because it was proven during the pandemic that they were more resilient, the ones that were more innovative and more digitalized. And to achieve that, in Europe especially, we need also to agree into systems of identity that can be interoperable. This is another layer of the problem we have. And of course, with any country that we want to collaborate on these principles. And let me also say that we have also to agree into a common definition, not for just the governance of datasets, but for AI itself. So you have an algorithm, and then you have the metrics, and then you put the data. So you have to understand first how it works, and then you have to decide if it's going to give you solutions or if it's going to be autonomous and take decisions. And this is where it can create challenges for our autonomy and losing control. So I think if we can clear this, then we understand that we have to make sure there will be some rules into what metrics should be included. What are the metrics that could cause bias? Or maybe AI can actually solve us, be less biased, because we feel we would be less biased than AI. I'm not that sure. So it's built up by people, and it's based on people that generate data. So if we manage to eliminate these contradictions and to avoid having biases, but instead use it in the best possible way, I think we can benefit, and we can have it to complement whatever we do instead of replacing us. So I think we are all on the same page, as also our friend says, VK, and I agree that we can take a step ahead without stifling innovation, but preparing the ground for broader collaboration.
Super. I want to come back to regulation if we have time later, but I want to move on to perhaps Martin and Jim, because you like me, work in a very global environment. And what we're seeing is a great deal of regulatory fragmentation. So, I work all the time with countries and everybody's doing something different. And so I wanted to sort of help you to think about and ask you to help us think about how that regulatory fragmentation actually gets in the way of your businesses, or in Marty's case, how difficult it is to actually help clients who are multinationals. So Jim, do you want to go first?
Sure. This is really an important point, and I appreciate you raising it. And it's a little bit odd because the modern democracies that feature market economies have much more in common in terms of shared values and shared way of looking at the world than they have in terms of a disparate impact. And so coming up, devising and implementing and collaborating on regulatory schemes that are harmonious shouldn't be hard. It should actually be easier. And there's a really significant cost to this fragmentation that you talked about. Some of the cost is that beneficial AI technologies will be slower in developing, but more importantly, and particularly in a time when the global economy will be attempting to recover from the COVID pandemic, that some jurisdictions will put themselves in a position where they won't have access to important technologies that could be really valuable in contributing to recovery if their regulations aren't harmonious with those of others. So there's it's very important, and it can be limiting both in terms of development of the new technologies but more importantly in the deployment of those technologies in places where they could really be valuable.
Thank you. Moving to Marty.
Yeah, thanks, and agree very much with everything Jim said. Avoiding barriers to the ability to sell and transfer technologies across borders is really important. I want to pick up on a theme that Eva mentioned, which is interoperability between regulatory regimes. That's really important. If we want to actually see trustworthy AI in practice, we need to make sure customers have access to really the full suite of AI that's available on the market, and avoid a situation where specific regulatory regimes basically turn us into islands of AI, and so that you can't transfer them and use them across borders. When thinking about how do you achieve that kind of interoperability between regulatory regimes, there are some fairly known, sort of tried and tested tools to do that. And it's something that I think our clients would very much encourage policymakers to think about. One is to the extent you can craft regulations so that operators in the marketplace can show their compliance by showing that they adhere to internationally recognized standards. That's one way to do it. And I know they're going to be talking about standards later today, but that's a technique that has been used in a lot of other fields, and is a way of allowing every government to adopt its own standards and its own rules, but allow companies to show their compliance through international standards. The second is mutual recognition schemes. Even in the past few years, where trade has been a very political and fraught area, countries have made actually real progress on mutual recognition schemes. And the EU and the US, for example, have in the last few years, I think in 2017 most recently, adopted a mutual recognition system for vaccines and medicines. And that's going to be a very simple and effective way of allowing companies to basically satisfy the criteria in one jurisdiction and be able to market in multiple jurisdictions. And then the third, which is fairly straightforward, is just dialogue. I think as we've seen throughout this conference, there's actually a tremendous amount of agreement among policymakers around the world on the principles and really the goals too. And to avoid everyone trying to implement those and ending up implementing those in different ways, just getting people together and talking about what are the goals and what are the best ways to achieve them.
Super, thank you. So that brings me to the national AI strategy. I have been advocating for some time that a country should have a national AI strategy, because without it, they can't decide what they want to do with AI, and they can't decide which regulations, if any, they need. But, you know, we have the UK with a national AI strategy that wasn't called that, but effectively was. We have the EU also advocating for national AI strategies, and also Singapore with a national AI strategy and some work that we did together with the forum in Singapore. But does having a national strategy, is it a good idea, or does it affect this interoperability between us, because it's actually suggesting that we think in a more focused nationalistic way? So perhaps I could start with Eva, some comments on national AI strategies.
Well, actually, we are trying to have a coordination of national strategies up to a level, and we would like to have like a European authority or agency, let's say, that would be able to control that and give specific guidelines and follow the technology, because it's very dynamic, it's transforming everything. We cannot set rules now that will not change. We have to be flexible, but at the same time, we need to have some common frameworks that we will agree on ethics, on standards and principles, and as I said, common definitions. So definitely each member state and its culture should develop it in their own way, and should maybe prioritize different things. But I do believe in order to achieve the maximum benefit for citizens, we have to have more interoperability.
Vraiment avoir plus d'interopérabilité. ¿Cómo es que se abogamos al tema de la privacidad? Entonces, localización de datos, tecnología.
Be under control. And also, I think it's very important to have safeguards through the whole life cycle of an AI system, so that it's proven that it follows specific rules. And to achieve that, you definitely need to have local and national authorities to be able to follow that, and also to implement cybersecurity for the critical infrastructures, and when AI, of course, is involved. So I think we can have a very good combination of both. So in Europe until now, if you develop a very strong national strategies, it has been very difficult to take, you know, there was friction. But I believe at this point, we are developing in a more balanced way. So we're gonna have a European strategy, and then the national strategies to be complementing all the things that they can prioritize. And I think this would be really important. And let me also say that the rights that we are talking in Europe, like the right to be forgotten and the right to redress, these are rights that it's great to have them at the European level. The right to redress if you believe something was unfair, if a decision was taken by an autonomous system, and you want to have a human actor to tell you what happened and what data were taken under consideration. Because as I said, AI is done by people, and it cannot be perfect in any case.
Super, thank you, Eva. So perhaps, Tim, I could go to you, because of course, you know, you had probably the first national AI strategy, if we think about the AI and industry papers. And then, of course, the Office of AI opened in the UK as well. So do you think that that has been truly beneficial in getting the public behind the work, and has it hindered or helped some of your discussions with your colleagues around the world?
Oh, I think in terms of building, if you like, in-house expertise, it's been enormously helpful. I mean, the Office for AI, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, the Alan Turing Institute, they're real powerhouses, actually, of expertise. And I think there's no real contradiction, actually, between, if you like, an AI national policy and an international policy, provided you have the appropriate elements in the appropriate box. So, for instance, you know, when you're talking about national policies, you need to talk about skills, you need to talk about finance, you need to talk about infrastructure, poverty research institution finance, you know, in terms of making sure that they're getting the support they need. But when it comes to research collaboration, think that's why we've joined the GPAI. When it comes to regulatory and ethical discussions, it has to be across the board. Otherwise, we get the kind of balkanization that Jim and Marty have been talking about, which, is completely unhelpful and doesn't lead to the ability. I mean, in the digital world, carving it up into little slices is completely counterproductive. So we've got to do that. And of course, the problem we now have, if we're not careful, we have almost too many international institutions all fighting for who wants to be the supreme regulator or the advisor on supreme regulation. So G20, OECD, Council of Europe, EU.
Conseil de l'Europe, la communauté européenne. J'espère que nous aurons une vraie collaboration entre ces institutions.
Is the next goal, because I think the national industrial policies, are beginning to come together quite reasonably, actually.
Super, thank you. And thank you for mentioning that, because we are actually at the forum trying to be that tent where we try to bring the best practices of everybody together. And so more in 2021 about that.
More power to your elbow in that case.
Thank you. But I want to ask the same question of VK and Singapore.
Right. Thank you, Kay. First, I think it's a good thing that most countries around the world, those with mature economies and concern over the rule of law, have started to look at this first from a national perspective. Because if we don't start thinking about these issues and waiting for others to move ahead, it might be too late. And in this context, educating the public and creating awareness and building trust around the potential widespread use of AI is critical. So the concerns raised by Tim and the others insofar as the interoperability of AI is really important. And I like the use of the word or the words by Martin where he described his concern about islands of AI. I don't think that is really going to happen. The reality is, if we scan the world, is there are going to be really three main centers of innovation: China, Europe, and the US. And the concern, I think, many of the others outside there have, is that if the three of them don't have conversations in terms of interoperability, those outside these three centers of gravity will be faced with difficult choices. And that's something we have seen in certain other systems, like the use of wireless transmission telephones, where systems don't talk to each other. So it's really important that forums like this, the GPAI and the UN, are bringing together all of us and discussing these problems at a very early stage. Singapore's approach is one of pragmatism. And we are neutral, it's free of ideology. I think when we talk about standards, we're talking about standards that are safe, that are trustworthy, and will promote the use of AI in a manner that benefits the population. The one thing that is very clear to us, and I think to most of the other panelists, is that the idea of self-regulation by businesses is a myth. It's not going to happen. We have seen what's happened with the internet and some of the platform providers, and it's commercial needs over the wider good. And so, so the question now is, how do we approach this? And I'm sure you're going to get that to it in a moment. Regulation or ethical governance models, and what role and what pace do we take? I will wait until you address those questions directly to the rest of us.
Absolutely, and I certainly hope to get to it. But of course, I couldn't let your comment about self-regulation being a myth go by without asking Jim if he wants to comment on that.
I've been told by family members that my eyes betray me when I hear something with which I disagree, and I think that they popped very, very wide at that moment when the VK said what he said. I think there is area, but there are areas of agreement. Well, I'm not as cynical as he is about the need for and the opportunities for self-regulation. I would agree on him that it's not sufficient, and you know, our approach to building trust in AI is governance, a framework-based approach where each AI developer and deploying entity should be responsible for identifying its own principles and then identifying a series of organizational steps, controls, other behavioral rules that will cause them to adhere to their principles, and then to be very transparent about that. But that we won't establish sufficient trust unless there are enforceable obligations that are placed on both the developers and the deployers, and that will be something that will contribute to trust. That because left to their own devices, you won't have the necessary transparency, and you won't have the acceptance of this as a valuable part of an overall compliance system.
Super, thank you, Jim. So we are coming to the closing 10 minutes of our panel. It's gone very fast. So I'm now going to go into the sort of speed dating. You've only got 2 minutes to answer the next question, everybody. And that takes us back to this, you know, we've got our national AI strategies, we've commented upon that, but how do we operationalize the ethical chapter of our national AI strategy? And that's actually something we're working on with the government of India at the moment. But it's that regulation impedes innovation, and some of you have touched on it already. So we need to sort of balance. We have to have the public trust, which again, we've talked about. We have to have the trust in the technology, which Francesca talked about. And so VK, I'm going to give you the first 2 minutes to take this question away.
Thank you very much. My first observation is there's no one right way. And I think we are going to have different approaches to addressing this problem. So the Singapore approach has been very much a soft or lighter touch. And we are going for an ethical governance model, which is voluntary and which over time we think will take root in terms of creating the right mindset among businesses and policymakers as to how to approach the problem. It's extremely difficult, given the rapid pace of evolution, to pace how we're going to approach this problem. But we think that at this stage where we are at the cusp of substantial innovation, that regulation and especially over-regulation will impede innovation. But at the same time, and I refer back to my earlier observation about self-regulation being a myth, it is important to give guidance. And that's why I said it's not a bad thing to have national AI strategies. And from the national AI strategies, you have a coalescing of views internationally as to what might be acceptable. So it's very much a question, and as I said, different models will be taken. But over time, I think there will be regulation. But the present view from the Singapore context is that we rather work with the industry, understand the problems, and see how we can stimulate innovation without stymieing progress.
Super, thank you very much. And obviously we were delighted to work with you on that ethical framework, optional ethical framework. So Eva, can I come to you with the same question?
Well, I would say that we know where we want to go, so we have an ethical framework, and I believe it has to also be binding by law. And I do believe that we have to have ethics by design in order to make sure that AI will be trustworthy. I don't mean to the extreme, I mean the basic principles that I was mentioning before. So we don't want to have harmful AI, we don't have complete autonomous AI systems without any human control or liability. And we don't want to have exclusion from an insurance company or insurance system. And we don't want to have people being manipulated, and we want them to have the right for a fair decision. So I think these are the rules that we're discussing. And you mentioned before the mess of like global organizations trying to take the lead. I think the secret here is the word collaboration. We need to cooperate. We have to have their different aspects. And yes, we need the UN, we need the World Economic Forum, we need the OECD, and we need definitely EU. We set up the Center for AI to collaborate with OECD. So we are trying to have different approaches to see where is the common ground to agree, because the technology is unstoppable. And finally, we are all using already predictive AI when we're using Google Maps to understand the traffic around us. So this is predictive AI. So we have to rush and we have to prioritize better and protect people from the high risk AI. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you very much. And yes, I couldn't agree with you more. Collaboration is what we need. So Marty, can I move to you with the same question?
Sure, and agreed with everything that everyone has said here. And I want to pick up on a theme that Jim mentioned and also Francesca earlier, and that's the focus on governance frameworks. We're all trying to achieve the same kinds of thing, make sure that AI is accurate and that it's safe and that it's not biased. But if the regulation imposes, okay, this is the way you must test for bias, or this is what you have to do to achieve security or accuracy, that's going to be very difficult in that kind of a framework to achieve the interoperability that everyone wants to achieve. And that's why governance frameworks work well. It sort of says, this is how you have to organize yourselves if you're developing AI or if you're deploying AI, but then leave it to the operators to figure out, well, what's the best way to implement that governance framework in my own organization, given what I'm doing, what I'm developing, and what my customers' needs are. And so I think that kind of a governance approach works well. We've got a lot of experience with that in the cybersecurity area, and even in privacy. And in fact, aspects of the GDPR really are kind of a governance framework. They tell organizations how to think about these issues and how to evaluate whether there's a privacy risk. So I think building on that, I think we can find a lot of areas for harmonization when we start thinking about governance, how companies should think about, assess risks, identify them, and then mitigate them.
Super, thank you very much. So moving to Tim, obviously at the forum, we did work with the Office of AI around the procurement of AI by government. Governments, the procurement of AI, and it's not really a very sort of sexy thing to talk about, but actually it's really useful in terms of this regulation versus innovation. And so I wonder whether you could address this question with that lens, perhaps, Tim.
Yes, absolutely, Kay. I mean, that was a great piece of work by the WEF, and it was great that the UK government in collaboration picked that up. And I think that will eventually make a difference, but they need a compliance mechanism, which there isn't currently. And this is really the question, because, you know, each of our panelists, some prefer regulation, some prefer voluntarism, some prefer corporate standards. Actually, it all depends on the risk. And what we need, and this is the factor that we haven't yet got, is a common way of risk calibration. Because I think actually, if you're faced with something like live facial recognition, you understand that actually that does need to be regulated. On the other hand, if it's your choice of music or something, that doesn't need to be regulated. So you basically work through a hierarchy of purely voluntary, then corporate governance standards, then regulation, and you've got to make sure that actually we do have some sort of consensus on that. Very difficult to get there, but the next step is really getting that calibration of risk agreed, and then the tools that will help us understand how we comply with those various different aspects of governance. So actually, we've still got quite a long way to go, and I think recognizing that risk base is really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Tim. Thank you very much for pointing that out. And it is a theme that we've heard throughout this panel. So, Jim, closing us out, regulation, or does regulation really intervene with innovation? Can we have regulation and innovation?
Well, I think we can, and I think that regulation that promotes trust will actually promote innovation. That's the sort of most important principle for us, and for most of the reasons that have already been cited. So I'll try not to repeat those. A couple of things that we haven't talked about, though, I'll mention here is availability of data. This is one area of policy that we haven't touched on today, and that AI based on more data is generally more trustworthy. It's more accurate, it's better. So we should look for ways both to make public data sets available safely, securely, and we should create incentives for people to share private data sets, once again, safely and securely. The other thing I just want to close with are a couple of things that we think are damaging in regulation and could impede innovation. One is one-size-fits-all prescriptions, that it's very hard to view AI as a horizontal science where we can come up with a rule now that'll apply to everything. It's very, very context-specific. Risk is context-specific, so we need to give people a chance to assess risk in a very specific way. And then the other would be, the corollary of that is per se determinations of risk that invariably will apply a category that's too broad to that, and we will under-regulate some risks that can be very important, like facial recognition, and then over-regulate others that aren't very important. So the broad per se categorizations are things that we should probably avoid if we don't want to impede innovation.
Super. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today, and also bringing our panel to a close. You are all very good at 2 minutes maximum. Thank you so much. Nicholas, I'll hand back to you with the main themes of this panel really being that trust and assessment of risk and interoperability that is so important for us all going forward. Again, thank you so much to the panelists today.
Thank you very much, Kay, and thanks to all our panelists, which have set up our next panel, I think, very nicely. That was a great intercontinental dialogue, and very much appreciate everyone's remarks.